synod continues its sessions, it is getting closer and closer to its conclusion, and it is doing it in a fairly quiet way, although there is a prohibition for the synod members to tell what they are talking about. There is always some news that inevitably leaks. It is logical. For example, that one of the participants received applause when he spoke positively about the acceptance that there should be in the church to everyone, and in particular to people who practice homosexuality. This is a fact that we want to present as a novelty, but that has always been absolutely true in the church. The church has always welcomed everyone, and of course homosexuals and practicing homosexuals as well. And if not, as some famous people, for example, if he were alive, the Italian film director Zeffirelli could speak of that wonderful film of St. Francis, or the other, on the life of Christ, who not long before his death told his experience as a homosexual who sometimes did such acts, and yet he always felt welcomed by the church. It is one thing to welcome people. The church has always been open to everyone, and it is another thing to bless what these people do when what they do is wrong. There was also applause, much louder, for a laywoman who said that it was not necessary to insist so much on the subject of female priesthood because the real problems of women were quite different. The truth is that there little has been said about homosexuality in minor circles, in the small working groups. Instead, much has been said about the female priesthood, starting with the diaconate. But well, it is already known that the diaconate and they themselves, those who demand it, say it is. It is only the first step to the priesthood, and then the episcopate, and then the papacy, when a woman is there. It is not that they ask for all of it at once, but it is known that this is the way to go. And this has been talked about a lot in the synod. Of course, there is no conclusion, nor there could be. But if things are quite calm in the synod, the same is not happening outside. The letter that Cardinal Mueller, former prefect of the doctrine of the faith, wrote to Cardinal Duca, Archbishop Emeritus of Prague, regarding the answer that Cardinal Fernandez, current prefect of the doctrine of faith, addressed to Cardinal Duca, answering his tandubia, especially those referring to the communion of the divorced and remarried. Obviously, divorced and remarried without having obtained the marriage nullity is still being commented on. Cardinal Fernandez tells Cardinal Duca that following what was approved by the ecclesiastical province of Buenos Aires and ratified by the Pope, every divorced and remarried person can discern, accompanied by a priest, and knowing what the doctrine of the Church says, can discern for himself whether he can or not receive communion, and that the priest who has to give him communion cannot refuse it. Well, Cardinal Mueller writes to Cardinal Duca and tells him that his teaching of the current doctrine of the faith is in contradiction with the teaching of the two previous popes on the same subject, St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and that when there is an evident contradiction between two teachings of the magisterium, one can deny in conscience adherence to one of them, in this case of the recent one of Cardinal Fernandez. Cardinal Mueller also says, Monsignor Mueller says, the response of the doctrine of the faith, this is very serious, confirms that the magisterium of Francis expressly contradicts the magisterium of the popes who preceded him. It is a very strong accusation, and it also contradicts the teachings belonging to the deposit of faith, such as those issued at the Council of Trent. Along with this accusation, Mueller makes another, referring to what Fernandez has also said in his reply to Duca, saying that each episcopal conference now has to establish the conditions for priests to give communion to the divorced and remarried, although the last word in each diocese will be up to the bishop. On this, Mueller says, in view of this, a conclusion spontaneously arises. If the orientations are different, It will be the case that some divorced persons will be able to receive the Eucharist according to the lines of one diocese, and not according to the lines of another. And he concludes with a never-before-heard accusation. Therefore, that a person can receive communion in one local church and cannot receive a communion in another is an exact definition of schism. A former prefect of the doctrine of the faith accuses his successors at the head of the doctrine of faith of somehow promoting schism because he says that in one diocese a person can receive communion and in a neighboring diocese in the next village many times he can not longer receive communion, and this contradicts the unity of the Church based on the Eucharist. This is a schism, and a schism is being promoted. These are very harsh accusations of Cardinal Mueller that are being debated. I do not say within the Synod, perhaps more in the coffee breaks, but certainly outside of the Synod. Very serious and grave accusations. There are drums of war in the Church. But these are not the only drums of war. Even more serious, at least in another order, are those of Israel and the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. With the weapons available at the moment, and if the war spreads, the whole humanity could be devastated, everything could be destroyed, and we could all be destroyed. The situation is extremely serious, and for this reason the Pope has called for a day of prayer, fasting, and penance for Friday, the 27th, to ask God to stop the wars, including the one in Ukraine, to ask God for the gift of peace. It seems to me an extraordinary and timely initiative which I fully support. Our main weapon this moment is prayer. We believe in it, and we have to get down on our knees before the Lord begging for the gift of peace, begging that the leaders of the nations be aware of the seriousness of the moment, and of what can happen if each one does what he thinks he should do, and just starts throwing bombs at the others. Peace is necessary. Prayer for peace is necessary. There will be diplomatic initiatives that are already being taken, but we have to pray for peace. And while we are at it, and I think it's very good that the Pope has included prayer for peace and fasting and also penance, I think we should all examine our conscience about our contribution to the war. I'm not referring to the terrible, dreadful war in Israel and Gaza. By the way, I insist that the attacks of the terrorist group Hamas on Israel have no justification whatsoever, and they have to be condemned in an unequivocal way. But I repeat, we also have to pray for peace, so that what may happen will not be worse than what's already happened. And we have to examine our conscience to analyze what has been our contribution to the war. For example, if we are able to forgive our enemies we speak, while with reason of the teachings of Christ, for example, about adultery. He who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against the first. But we forget that there are other teachings of Christ, that they are very clear, and that the Lord repeats them, for example, in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us as we forgive. And at the end of saying the prayer, Jesus insists, which means that he gives enormous importance to it. If we do not forgive, if you do not forgive your enemies, you will not be forgiven. It is not enough to pray for peace far away. We must also be converted from the contributions that each one makes to the war, because one does not forgive one's enemies from the heart. One piece of news to finish. 10 priests from Nicaragua has been released by the dictatorial regime of Ortega in that country and have traveled to the Vatican. It is good news as far as the release of 10 priests who are unjustly imprisoned is concerned. And it's not good news because it carries with it that the dictator is once again getting rid of those he considers his opponents. Although the opposition these priests may have made may have been as minimal as making a procession in the streets without permission. Let us pray. Let us pray for peace in the Church, for these drums of war that sound, so that the Church may always be faithful to the teachings of Jesus Christ. Let us pray for the Pope in such a delicate moment, because he is the vicar of Christ. Let us pray for peace in the world. We join the Holy Father in this call to prayer, fasting, and penance on the 27th. Until next week, God willing.